what else did I want to say about Heraclitus? I got a couple of things here. Okay, so there was one other thing he said in the lecture that I found interesting. So he was discussing, I think this is in the lecture on Thales,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about the development of philosophy as a subject. And he said, well, why do we say that philosophy was born in ancient Greece and not in any of the civilizations around ancient Greece or before ancient Greece? Because they also flourished, right? Like the Babylonians, the Egyptians, in some way they flourished.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about an intelligible, this worldly universe versus an unintelligible universe pulled by the strings of a god from another dimension, something like that. And so the Greeks had more political freedom, and they had what he described as an unusual religion, in that it considered gods as part of the universe, not creators of the universe. The universe wasn't created. They're in the universe, and they're a natural evolution, and they're just as subject to its laws as, or implicitly, they're just as subject to its laws as humans are. They're not omnipotent or omniscient, right?
Yeah.
And at first I was like, well, okay. When I've heard these descriptions, like the consequence of an unintelligible universe that is a creation of a god pulling it by strings from another dimension is that you hate this life and this earth. And when I read something like that, I'm like, oh, really? Like, how does that work? But then he gave the example of, like, if you're in a jail cell, and would you spend your time studying the molecular structure of the bars, or would you be trying to get out? And then that really illuminated that perspective for me. And I remember I told you I read Feynman's book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman.
Yeah.
And there's a story in that. And the story is about these Orthodox Jews they want to speak to Feynman about science. So he's like, yeah, of course I'll speak to them about science. And they start asking him all these questions about electricity. And they're trying to work out if electricity is fire. And he's explaining to them, that it's not fire, and it's this and that. And that he realizes that they're not interested in the science at all. They don't care. They're just interested in the application of a law from the Bible.
Yeah.
And it kind of shocked him. And I think that, that's actually, I just realized that that's an example of that, right? Because you're concerned with laws given to you from another dimension. You're not concerned with this world. That would be an instance, a concrete instance
think
of
so.
what Peikoff is
Sounds
illustrating.
like it. Yeah, you're detached from the world in front of you. It's you're stuck in your head in a way. The world of forms and mystical universe that is separated from your life.
Are there any other instances of Heraclitus that you can think of that are like modern examples of, there's obviously, we're talking about the being raised in a family that is
abusive household might be the best example.
But in that case, I don't mean like implicitly, because inconsistency is one thing, but someone then reading something inspired by the Heraclitean metaphysics and then applying it in some ways another. I'm sort of looking for the latter. Because would you agree that in that case of, like, let's say, abusive household, they're not really thinking in those terms at all, or they never did?
Right. Yeah, anything that discusses like multiple timelines of history, I think those are common in like sci-fi, like trying to think, usually to do with can you predict anything about the world? Usually also one's about free will. There's a show called Devs. It's about a computer that can predict everything, but at the same time, their theory is that the theory that they're building the computer on is based on the idea that there's multiple possibilities that could exist simultaneously, that all existence is simultaneous with all possibilities, and it can multiply endlessly. And then in that kind of way, it's like, how do you know what's true if everything can be true at once?
Right. So it isn't.
Yeah. It's making a potential into an actuality, that even the potentials are real.
Right.
It's kind of somewhat insane interpretations
What's
of
the
quantum
name of
physics
that?
as well.
What's the name of
The
that
show is
story?
devs,
Devs.
but also the Boris story of forking paths. It's kind of about that too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think of his analogy? So he made an analogy between studying the history of philosophy and probing a patient's past, so a psychological past, because
Yeah.
to understand his present, you can only fully understand his present as the development or offshoot of his past. Do you think that is a good analogy?
Yes, I think it's a really good one. I like the
Yeah.
idea that we have to consider the context, the way this has affected the development of philosophy and even the development of man himself, like in terms of civilization. How has man as a species developed? How has philosophy affected the lives that we have now? In what way does history of the past, or does history have to do with the nature of the present too? Like, you have to get to the knowledge in some way that it shows you the way we got here in terms of knowledge, and how to correct things that are bad, correct things that are errors, to find the truth or look into new ideas, that kind of thing.
What would you say then to someone who said to you, well, why study the past? Why not just look today and observe what the errors are and correct the errors of today? Like, why do you need to go into the past? Just as in, you could make I know that certain psychologists might make the case, you don't need to go into the past. You just correct the wrong premises of today in your psychology, and that's it. You don't need to go into your childhood when you were 2 years old. So that's the psychological version. So the philosophical version is, yeah, why not just, okay, there's errors today, why not just correct them? And why do we need to go into the past?
Well, we don't exist ahistorically, as if the nature of man has nothing to do with the way it's developed, or even what you think is true can be influenced by the development of mankind. That we can question what we take for granted based on how did we get here? How did things develop in a way that we can recognize if it is true, or is something that developed, or is something that always existed? Really, it's a matter of taking into account full context of your nature, because your nature also includes the society in which you live. You also need to look at how that has developed,
Right.
in what ways, the way the world has turned out. What does that have to, how did it get there? You could just say, well, it exists, but understanding why, explaining it, is like a deeper understanding of principles.
Yep. Okay. I suppose the analogy breaks down at some point, because
Yes.
In the case of studying the history of philosophy, it already assumes that you've come to the conclusion that philosophy is what is fundamentally shaping our actions and our history as men. Whereas in the case of like a psychotherapist, you don't necessarily know what context is relevant. So, there's that example given by Viktor Frankl, where there's a psychotherapist who's working with someone, and this guy is like, he doesn't like his work, and he's very unhappy. And the guy's, the work represents your relationship with your father. And then the guy continues working and he's miserable. And then he goes to another psychologist and he says, just quit your work and try something else. And he does, and he's happy. And so I guess that it breaks down in that sense, because I think in psychology, you don't necessarily know what in the past is a relevant context. Whereas in this case, we're very much narrowed in on philosophy specifically, right? We're narrowed in on the core, what we believe is at core fundamental, or is fundamentally shaping our actions, history, the way we think, and so on, right?
Yeah, from the objectivist perspective, yeah.
Yeah,
That would be the purpose of history of philosophy.
right. Okay. All
I
right, got
think
it. So
Nietzsche was one of the first people to really bother with using history of philosophy as an aspect of philosophy itself that is relevant to doing philosophy. I mean, that
right,
is genealogy of morals,
right,
genealogy of morality, where he is looking how did we get here, and what does that tell us about the nature of morality and nature of man, if
right,
anything, or what mess has it made within
right.
the world we live in, and that
So
can tell you a lot.
okay, I see now. So it's a kind of nice illustrative analogy, but for it to work properly, then psychology as a field would need to develop to the point where it would need to be able to identify what in the past is relevant to identifying the things you could change now, basically. We've already got that, let's say in philosophy, or that's what we claim. We already know what context is relevant to being able to identify and correct our present errors. We have that in philosophy.
Yeah,
We don't necessarily have that in psychology. Do you think the way I've just described that is
I
that
think
sounds
that's a
accurate?
good description.
Yeah. Okay, cool. You said that if we want to pursue values, um, we need to like if you want to pursue values, you need to study into like philosophy of history because in order to cure the patient, that is Western
Yeah,
civilization with his mixed premises, you need to know his past
yeah,
development or at least philosophical past development. Do you think,
yeah.
or even to defend your values and you need a philosophical arsenal to defend the values that you do have. This is in the abstract. I haven't quite concretized it yet.
Yeah,
Defend the values you do have and fight against those disvalues to fight against the disvalues. But do you think this is applicable to everyone, like the plumber, the baker, the programmer, or it's just something that's restricted to more limited to humanities-based intellectuals?
I think it's applicable more to if you want to look to changing the world, even intellectual activism usually.
Yeah. Okay.
1 second.
Sure.
So I
Yeah.
think it's
Okay.
important for, like, if you want to have a wide scale impact on something, it's not for just like how do you fix the issues of like your friends or how do you help them, but a more wider thing, like if you want to have an impact on society or change the way things are progressing or have some kind of impact rather than merely watching, we would want
Yeah.
to understand where things come about, how they come about, how do we change it.
Yeah.
It's more of an activist perspective. I think Rand like that to some extent. She didn't merely do it because it was fun, but it would have an impact on history in a way that influences her own life too.
Right. And then, so if if we're speaking about a philosophical arsenal, that I guess philosophical arsenal is actually broader than as a metaphor is broader than just studying philosophical history. But if we're speaking of having that philosophical arsenal, that might mean thinking better about your own life and your own values, and then that might mean I could be stretching here, and that might mean reading Nietzsche, for example, or reading Aristotle,
Yeah,
but you can't read them unless like I'm doing this because I couldn't read Nietzsche, right? There's too
yeah,
much context. And so it might mean that you don't need necessarily all the details, but you might need some knowledge still,
yeah,
even if you just want to do a general reading of some philosophy.
yeah. There's that more practical aspect, of course. It gives
Yeah.
context to why ideas have what people are responding to, even
Right.
what Rand is responding to. She's
Right.
not responding to a vacuum. There's specific ideas she's responding to, and where do those ideas stem from? It gives you context to what the hell she's talking about.
do you, do you think Rand specifically is deceptively easy to read in that when I
Yes.
read it, it's not that I necessarily get stuck and go, I don't know what she's talking about. I know, but then do I understand? Because you're saying she's responding to things, but it's not always clear. Like it's almost, it feels like when you read her, it's self-contained. You can read it and get it, but
Yeah.
that may not be the case.
Yeah, I think it is deceptively simple. I think that's
Yeah,
why people like think she's an idiot sometimes. Like they're really narrowing on like the sense like always ASA, like, oh, everybody knows that. I think it is what
right.
it is, duh.
Yeah,
That's not the point, people. I mean, yeah,
yeah,
it's obvious, but what does it imply when you take into account everything else she said, her influences, and
right.
even the whole context of what you know she's written? Like she's a dense, she is a systematic thinker in the sense of she's always well integrated with her ideas.
Right.
There she says one thing, it has some relationship to something else she said always.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. I think it's only in the last it's been maybe a while, but last few months it's something that I've started thinking about. Like you can read it, but especially I've gone quite in depth with you into Opar, and I still can't say there's a lot I understand. Like I don't know, it just doesn't feel clear to me, although the writing is extremely clear. And I'm realizing when I then get into Nietzsche or I read
Yeah,
the introduction to Aristotle, oh, okay, there's all this which is actually relevant um,
yeah,
to some of especially what I did understand of Nietzsche is his I understood enough to see that he was getting at the philosophy as potentially a process of rationalization, as an admission, a personal admission of the person's psychology, is sort of getting at that,
yeah,
um, which is what she often speaks about, right?
yeah. There is some sort of Nietzschean element to Rand, I think,
Yeah,
that she might not acknowledge, but that's more unique to my analysis. But
right.
I think you're right. It's part of that process of questioning the status quo in a way that's bombastic. Rand is bombastic for sure.
Yeah,
And that's kind of the effect I think you're looking at.
right. Okay, so yeah, he's speaking the introductory lecture. He gives the analogy of you arrive at Mars and there are people walking on their
Yes,
hands and
I
they're
love
like
that
listed.
one.
I love it as well. It's amazing. And then he gives all these crazy examples, and it's beautiful because I didn't even think about this, but it's all embodied in one symbol, which is a skyscraper in New York that does not have the 13th floor on it. How do you get
Yes,
this mix of
it's
rationality and
insane.
irrationality, of technology and ancient, what is it, numerological magic,
Yeah,
um, and
eschatology, I think it's called.
eschatology, is it? Okay. Yeah, but that's a great symbol. But he says, what's the result of this irrationality? So he gives a few examples. He says, I don't have enough knowledge of these fields to know, but like he says, modern education, in some sciences,
Mhm.
obviously not all of science, but there's elements of science that apparently are denying the law of non-contradiction, all this other stuff. And then he says, okay, what's the result of this irrationality? Psychologically increasing neurosis and psychosis, politically escalating violence and march on the part of the West towards some version of fascism or communism. How does
Mhm.
one, like, there's obviously assumed context here, because how do I personally do not know. Okay, it makes sense. There's some irrationality, but are these things that he lists, which correlate or don't correlate? I don't know. Maybe they've always been around. Are they the result of that? Like, you need context to understand that, right? Because I don't have that. I don't know for sure that, okay, all this apparent increasing neurosis and psychosis is a result of this philosophy.
Um, that one's always hard because you're trying to look at the nature of the causal relationship of philosophy to
Yeah,
mankind, and in a way, is working from having already reached the conclusion that
yeah,
philosophy is a guiding force of history.
right.
I mean, that is the
That's
premise, I think.
Yeah. Otherwise, why else would we study this course? So it's like,
Yeah.
that's just an assumed, that's part of the
Yes.
context. It's a separate investigation of the
Yeah, I
lecture.
think that's the assumption of the lectures.
Got it.
But
What
if you
did you
want to
think?
prove it, well, that's a different question,
Yeah.
as you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I've learned that. I think in the past I would have asked you to prove it, but we can
Yeah.
skip that for now. What did you make of philosophical psychology? Is that currently something even? Is that even, or
I
is
don't
that
like that
his?
distinction.
Yeah. Okay.
It is something I've heard Binswanger use as well. I'm not a fan of that term.
Yeah.
And I would just call it psychoepistemology, maybe, not try to make it more weirder than that, like philosophical psychology. I mean, that sounds more like early psychology to me when you
Right.
say that. And I'd
Right.
rather distinguish between, say, the implications of philosophy on man and keep psychology as a field of science. I mean, that is that cross the line between philosophy and psychology. It's always that really close line.
Yeah, he gave this description, and even like, okay, the basic philosophical nature of man, which is not based on experimental, well, no, if it was based on experimental observations, that would be scientific psychology. But it deals
Yeah.
with questions like, does man have free will, or is he determined? What is the relationship between reason and emotions, etc.? What would you say if someone said to you, okay, well, Louis, these things need to be based on experiments and observations. You can't just arbitrarily say, man does or doesn't have free will, or you need to, even identifying the relationship between reason and emotion requires scientific investigation. This is not for philosophy.
I'll
What
put
would
it
you say
this
to that?
way. Well, I would just say this is a matter of philosophy of mind, I think is the term I would use instead. Then it would capture the same thing, but without the baggage, I think, of the terms would be clearer, I think.
Right.
What exactly was the question?
Oh, if someone said to you, okay, well, that's all good. Like, you're saying that philosophy deals with the nature of man, with whether he
Yeah.
has free will, what's the relationship between his reasons and emotions. But these things need to be based on scientific investigation. We need to do experiments. We need to make observations. Like, this is not for philosophy. What would you say to that?
It would depend on if we mean a science in the broader sense of the nature of reality versus specific scientific proof. I think there's a difference between going into the details of the how versus broader things that are just general observations without doing experiments necessarily. They don't necessarily require experiments.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
The more general way of thinking about science, not in the way English uses the word science.
In
Like,
English, science is used specifically
for more like
to
the scientific method and
right. So like
specific investigation.
observation, recording
Yeah.
observations, experiments.
But this might include like sociology. It might include some psychology. It does use some observational science, I think, but not to the degree that, say, talking about how does memory work in the basal ganglia or something. That would
Right.
be a very specific question.
Right. Do you think so? Science is necessarily, it's supposed to focus on some delimited aspect of reality, whereas philosophy focuses on reality as a whole, and so it's much broader, and it sets terms or a framework for you to then think about a more delimited aspect of reality. So, for example, mathematics deals with quantity, right, which is just one aspect of the philosopher's categories. But then where does that, when someone creates a field like systems theory, they're almost, is there a mistake somewhere and that they're stretching too much? Because systems theory, especially if it's defined by, when we spoke about, interconnected, I forget the definition. It was like elements that are interconnected into a coherent whole. Is there a mistake somewhere there? Not that there's nothing of any value in the field at all, but like in the broader sense, is there something going wrong when you set up a field of science that is studying everything?
I think this gets difficult when we had to break down the nature of the questions and the way we deal with them and the way evidence comes in, or what counts as evidence. Like I think in the Aristotelian way, there's first philosophy, which is metaphysics, really. That's what Aristotle called first philosophy. I mean, you could analyze the nature of being, and there's one way to study that, which we wouldn't generally call that science per se, but he also looks into the nature of eternal objects, which is cosmology, which starts to become very sciencey and starts to rely on specific investigations and proofs, not just general observations. Or we could think of practical application of ideas which might require noting specific nature of particulars. Aristotle thought of science as more as an application to particulars. So when we're looking at a particular, say, type of brain, we have to do a specific type of analysis, and usually with deduction or induction, but it's a different process than, say, what does it mean to live or to be alive? Or what does it mean to change one thing to another? I mean, that's a broader question. So a lot of it really comes down to what kind of questions. But in modern science, usually philosophy sets the context for how you investigate. And once you do that, then you could maybe interpret how you could do further philosophy on specific types of claims. Like if we understand, we ask about free will, well, what is it? That's philosophical, but then you could ask about the nature of it. But then we had to go back to doing some philosophy again. Like if we know that the nature of it works this way, do we need to modify anything? Did we miss something? Is there something else that context might change? Does it change anything when we know? Things like that.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how that works after listening to some of these lectures. Like, okay, I've got a sticky note here. He gives that example with the match, right? And I just do a mark on this sticky note. And now the sticky note is the same sticky note from before, but it's also not the same sticky note from before.
Exactly.
And therefore it is and it isn't. And therefore contradiction is, the universe is just contradiction and all change. And I'm seeing how, okay, so you go from these small observations and you make these conclusions, and then they do set a framework for how you think about things. And so the framework is very important, right? And that framework is derived from basic observations, but you can go wrong and it's very difficult. It's because it's so abstract. And so I'm starting to see, okay, so philosophy does set the terms for your thinking in a lot of other different contexts. It forms like a more fundamental context.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, philosophy of mind. I like that more than philosophical psychology.
Yeah.
Actually, what do you think of, for studying philosophy, like Aristotle developed logic, but he needed some maths to develop logic, or at least back then maths was philosophy. In the beginning, according to Peikoff, if you were in anything, you were in philosophy, because that was just study of knowledge in general, and from there flowered the development of other fields, right? But
I would just clarify that he mostly came up with deduction is really the clearest thing to say what Aristotle came up with. Right. He came up with the science of deduction, that sense of logic, and formalizing some ways of putting together premises. People didn't understand conclusions, but he abstracted into like thinking about just the terms rather than the concretes, or trying to think at a wider scale, like systematically going through the way premises relate to one another. And that becomes deduction, like taking the already accepted premises and seeing where they necessarily or don't necessarily lead.
So, but he needed maths to get to that, right? He needed some.
Yes, geometry, specifically geometry.
And so can we say even today, if you want to study philosophy, it's necessary that you learn some fundamentals of those fields, like some fundamentals of math, some fundamentals of, geometric proofs. And it would give you it would be better for you rather than just dive straight in.
I think so.
In the way, mimic the process of learning that some of these philosophers, in order to get to the point they did, they would have had to, there were certain things they had to integrate first.
Yeah, on some level, I think you need a basic idea of some basic proofs. And then
Right.
but there's some more modern things too, in addition to Aristotle, that make it clear. Additional developments to the way of thinking about it.
What would you say is I'm jumping here to Heraclitus, sorry for the abrupt jump. What would you say is the modern sentiment, this is probably more a question of psychology, actually. The modern sentiment behind someone today saying everything is change, everything is flowing and changing, and that Heraclitean view or metaphysics.
Sometimes looking at world news, sometimes that makes people like, well, everything's different every day, or like I can't predict one day to the next because there's so much chaos in the world. Or sometimes it comes from perspective of science, like, oh, and their misinterpretations of quantum physics sometimes. Sometimes that's all these other times. I think it is because of having grown up in bad contexts. I think many people have grown up in dysfunctional families, for better or for worse. And I think that impacts the development of thinking about things does reality have a nature, a predictable nature? It gives you maybe a negative view on life. Right. And I think that's also partly responsible or caused by education. I don't think it is well integrated with integration reality, but more like you're presented a series of facts and nobody really prevents you a guide on how to integrate. Either figure it out or you don't, or someone has to tell you. Not everybody's so lucky.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going even a little more off topic here, but the concept of sense of life, it's preconceptual, right?
Yes.
To me, that would mean then it's almost it would seem to be non-volitional. Isn't the conceptual the volitional? And then another aspect of it is, so let's say it's partially non-volitional, or maybe even to a significant extent non-volitional. But then in addition to that, without a self-conscious method, error is guaranteed, meaning your sense of life is guaranteed to have errors in it.
I'd be careful to say that. Avoid saying that a sense of life is anything other than just an emotional sum. So in that sense, it could be a lot of automatized stuff. I'm trying to think how to approach this question better.
Well, put it this way: if I were to try to reword it, then if it's preconceptual, from an objectivist perspective, free will is the fact that we're conceptual means we have free will. So if we're preconceptual, then do we have free will? I guess that's more of a question. And then meaning, as we're developing as a child, we're preconceptual. So do we have free will? That is adding to that sum that is our sense of life. And in addition to that, if we're preconceptual, it means we do not have an objective method to derive conclusions about reality. So that if we don't have a method, error is guaranteed. We know that if we have a method, error is possible, but if we don't, error is guaranteed or certain. So then that would mean that every sense of life is certain to have errors, because we don't have a method for forming, drawing conclusions about reality necessarily. There's no self-conscious method. So we're going to go wrong somewhere. But what do you think of
But
that?
what do you mean by error in a sense of life?
A
What exactly
mistake.
do you mean by?
So like you don't have a method, you don't have a self-conscious method of objectivity, you don't have logic. And so as a child, you're going to draw conclusions. And because you don't have a method, error is guaranteed. You're going to make mistakes in the way you draw conclusions. Versus, let's say you were a child and you're fully conceptual and you applied the method of logic consistently, then
Yeah.
error is possible, but it won't be guaranteed versus the child who doesn't have a method,
Well, I
which
try
no
to
child can
say
have anyway.
wrong about what exactly? Like wrong that the universe is not this way. I mean, it doesn't seem like
Well,
it could be wrong.
I'll give you
It's
an
just,
isolated example where you're going to be wrong about drawing discrete conclusions in different situations, which then add to your sense of life. Like, oh, my parents are mean to me, therefore
yeah,
I'm a bad person. That kind of stuff.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean that's the way emotions form. And I don't
Right.
see yeah, that is the nature. It's just we could say that the development of emotions is not something you decide. You can influence it, of course. And it's almost like it's not as much control as anything else, but I wouldn't see it as something that's wrong as much as when you're faced with something, often your emotions respond to it on some level, that it does take it in, whether or not you want to. I mean, I guess I could be saying that objectivism is wrong to the extent that all emotions are caused by something conceptual. I don't think that's always the case. I think most are caused by something conceptual, but
Yeah.
not all.
Yeah.
I think of those that aren't, this is where like you can't do anything about it. It's just all you do is put yourself in a better context to make yourself
Right.
face the good things more often.
Right.
Like in the
Okay.
way that if you eat sugar all the time, it just starts to feel pleasurable in a way that you might want it over other things. And that might cause you to, it's just you only view it that way after repeated exposure. And that can harm you or influence you, but that's only specific types of emotions,
Right.
which might apply to things like, is reality consistent? Well, if you never experience consistency, I don't think even your mind naturally functions very well in the first place.